Rain beat down on the district in relentless sheets, turning the narrow alleys into trickling rivers and leaving the concrete towers streaked with grime. Leroy Vosk hunched his shoulders against it, his coat already soaked through from the walk home. The glow of the registry towers loomed to his left, their cold lights flickering across the puddles like broken stars. He moved with the weary gait of a man who had walked the same path too many times before. 10 hours spent poring over freight records had left his eyes aching and his skull pulsing faintly. His world was built from repetition. Unlock the door, hang the coat, heat a ration tin, read until fatigue claimed him. That ritual was what kept him steady in a district where chaos lived in the streets. He depended on its sameness, the dull predictability of survival. When he reached his block, he climbed the chipped stairwell, his hand dragging along the rusted rail. The hall smelled faintly of damp plaster and burned coil wires. By the time he slid his key into the lock, his body was already moving in habit, expecting silence, emptiness, the stillness of his single-room flat. The door creaked open, hinges swollen with moisture, and he stepped inside. Then he stopped. His satchel slipped a little from his shoulder. The air wasn't silent. A sound threaded through the room, low and steady, unmistakable once he registered it. Water. Running water. 4. A heartbeat. His mind leapt to the worst conclusion, a burst pipe. Repairs would take weeks. The landlord would dock him credits. The paperwork would pile up until his desk drowned beneath it. But then he caught the rhythm of the sound. Too smooth, too regular. Not a leak, a shower. His shower. Leroy froze, pulse tightening. The door had been locked. The kitchen window was latched. Yet someone was inside. His eyes swept the flat in quick, sharp motions. Then he saw it, the rear corridor window ajar, rain dripping through the crooked frame. The latch was splintered. Someone had forced there. Way in. He dropped his satchel quietly and reached for the mop handle propped against the wall. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it gave his hand something to hold, something to steady the trembling in his chest. Step by step, he moved down the narrow hall, the hiss of falling water growing louder. Steam drifted through the thin crack beneath the bathroom door. Soap clung faintly to the air. He knocked once, hard, his voice sharp with nerves. "Who's in there?" The water kept falling, but then a voice carried out, hoarse and trembling. "I'm not stealing. I just needed a wash." The mop handle loosened in his grip. A woman, not the threat he had imagined. He pushed the door open a fraction, steam curling outward, fogging his glasses until he wiped them with his sleeve. Inside, the bulb's harsh light gleamed against white tiles, casting long shadows through the mist. And there she was. A woman stood beneath the spray, her back half turned to him. Blue skin glistened where water stripped away layers of dirt. Long strands of green hair clung to her shoulders, heavy with soap and rain. Her clothing was nothing more than scrap a halter, torn at the seams, a skirt held together by fraying straps, so soaked they revealed more than they hid. Her body trembled not from fear but exhaustion, each movement deliberate, as she scrubbed at her arms as if to scrape away more than filth. She turned her head slowly, and he caught her eyes luminescent, glowing faintly in the harsh light. Not hostile, desperate. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't throw me out. I'll leave after. Just let me be clean once." Every rational thought told him to end this, to drag her out, to call building security. She had broken into his home. She had crossed a line. But the sight of her, shaking, half-clothed, begging only for the right to wash, rooted him to the spot. He had seen her kind before in the alley's discarded workers, outsiders driven to the gutters when their contracts ended. People most avoided, people security beat without hesitation. He felt the weight of choice press on him. His gaze flicked to the water meter flashing yellow, warning of consumption above quota. His landlord would notice. He would be billed. And yet, his hand moved without thought. He pressed the reset switch, silencing the alarm. The woman stilled under the spray, eyes fixed on him through the steam, waiting for cruelty that didn't come. Leroy reached into the cabinet, pulled out a clean towel, one he almost never used, and held it out through the doorway. His voice steadied. Finish, then dry off. For a moment she didn't move. Her lips trembled as if bracing for a trick, for the blow that always came. But when none followed, she gave the smallest nod. Thank you. Leroy shut the door and stepped back into the hall, his pulse hammering. For the first time in years, his careful routine had cracked. And in that fracture, something dangerous and alive had entered his life. The sound of water still filled the narrow flat, steady and low, a rhythm that didn't belong to Leroy Vosk's life. He stood in the hall, mop handle leaning against the wall now, his palms damp from more than just the rain. Steam pressed outward from the bathroom, curling through the dim corridor light. His breath came too quick, his mind caught between 100 thoughts, but none of them added up to action. He should have called security. He should have dragged her out by the arm. He should have done anything other than what he'd done, resetting the meter, offering her a towel. When the water cut off, silence dropped heavy. Leroy braced himself for the creak of the window as she slipped away into the rain, the same way she'd come. But instead, the bathroom door opened slowly, and she stepped into the hall barefoot, wrapped in the towel he had given her. Droplets of water ran down strands of green hair that clung to her skin. The grime was gone, revealing luminous blue flesh beneath, startling in its clarity. She looked more herself now, not a shadow of desperation, but something vivid, fragile, and proud all at once. Leroy forced his voice to stay even. You said you're not a thief. Then tell me why here? Out of all the buildings, why mine? She lifted her chin slightly, meeting his gaze as though expecting the interrogation. Because I saw you before, she said, her voice still hoarse, but steadier now. At the south corridor. You left bread near the runoff pipe. You thought. No one noticed, but I did. That told me enough. You don't kick people when they're already on the ground. The words caught him off guard. He remembered the moment, barely hurrying home in the rain, spotting a figure crouched near the drainage line, leaving half his ration tin without a word. He hadn't thought it mattered. He hadn't thought anyone would remember. His throat worked, but no answer came. Instead, he motioned toward the kitchen. Sit. Eat something before you leave. Her shoulders tensed as though she expected a trick, but the towel tightened around her body, and hunger betrayed her hesitation. She followed him into the small kitchen, her steps slow, deliberate, each one measured. She sat at the little table, like someone stepping into enemy territory, back straight, eyes never leaving him. Leroy set bread, a tin of fruit, and a cup of water in front of her. She took the bread first, breaking it into small pieces, chewing slowly. Every movement tried to mask her desperation, but her shaking hands betrayed her. He sat across from her, his eyes steady. Do you have a name? She swallowed before answering. Orvia. Speaking it seemed to cost her, as though names were. Things you only risked when you believed you might live to hear them again. Leroy, he replied, though she already knew. Her gaze dropped to the cup between her hands. Workers' quarter, she said finally. The company ended contracts. When they downsized, they kept the men who could lift and throw. Women like me were sent out. No shelter, no credits, no place to go. If you stay too long in the alleys, the streets decide what you are. They decided I was trash. Her voice didn't break when she said it, but something in the flat grew heavy. Leroy felt it, the truth of her words pressing in on the narrow walls. He had seen evictions, the workers forced past the gates, the guards locking them out, while neighbors pretended not to watch. He had turned his eyes away like everyone else. It was easier not to look. Now, here she was in his chair, eating his food, making it impossible to look away. "You broke into my home," he said finally, his tone even but blunt. "You know what that means." Orvia didn't flinch. She placed the last bite of bread carefully on the plate, not greedy, not pleading, just deliberate. "I know. If you send me out now, I won't make it through the night. Not with the cold, not with the rain. That's the choice you have. Turn me out and be safe, or let me stay and risk whatever comes with me." Her honesty struck harder than excuses would have. She wasn't bargaining. She wasn't manipulating. She was handing him a truth no one else would. Leroy leaned back, exhaling slow. The air between them was tense, sharp, but there was no cruelty in her gaze, only the stubborn pride of someone who had nothing left to lose. He stood, pulled a second towel from the cupboard, and dropped it on the table beside her plate. "Stay. Tonight," he said at last. "Tomorrow, we'll see." For the first time, her shoulders loosened. She didn't smile, but her voice softened. "That's enough." As the steam from his cracked kettle rose between them, Leroy realized something he hadn't in years. His flat no longer felt like just his own. It felt unsettled, alive, and with Orvia sitting across from him, eating the last of his bread, he knew his routine had been broken in a way that could never be mended. Gray light slid between the blinds when Leroy opened his eyes the next morning. For years, mornings had been predictable, the faint whir of pipes, the ache in his shoulders from sleeping too stiff on the narrow cot, the quiet silence of a room. Meant for one. But this morning was not the same dot. There was movement in the kitchen. Soft, deliberate, like someone afraid of being heard. He lay still for a moment, letting the unfamiliar sound soak into him. The rhythm of his apartment had shifted. It no longer beat with the quiet of solitude. He pulled himself up, the blanket he'd taken to the floor crumpling beneath him. His neck ached from the boards, but he ignored it. Orvia stood at the counter, still wrapped in the towel he'd given her the night before. Her long green hair hung damp down her back, catching the pale light and shining faintly against the gray-blue of her skin. She was heating water in the pan he rarely touched. Her back was straight, her posture careful, as though she was bracing for him to tell her to stop. "You don't have to," Leroy said quietly. She glanced over her shoulder, eyes wary, but her voice came steady. "If I stay, I contribute. Even with nothing, I do something. I won't be treated like a burden." Her words struck harder than he expected. He had thought about pity, about danger, about rules broken. But he hadn't thought about what it meant for her to insist on being seen as more than charity. He moved to the table, sat down without arguing. She divided what little food remained into 2 equal portions, sliding half toward him with precision. They ate in silence, but it wasn't quite the silence he knew. Hers was careful, as if waiting for the moment he would change his mind. His was restless, circling around the fact that he had already lied to himself. He'd told her she could stay one night, then decide. But he knew deep down, knew that when the moment came, he wouldn't turn her out. When the plates were cleared, she folded the towel she had used to dry herself, placed it neatly on the chair, every gesture deliberate, as though proving she hadn't ruined it. Leroy watched her, the thought slipping in uninvited. How long had she been living like this? Measuring every action, rationing every word, so she wouldn't lose even the little she had. The rain outside had eased, but the district remained gray, its noise faint through the walls. He had work to do, forms, numbers, ledgers waiting in the registry. he found himself reluctant to leave. He had never thought of his apartment as anything more than a cell, a shell where he waited for the next day. Now it felt like a place where something could happen, and he didn't want to miss it. Before leaving, he hesitated at the door. She stood near the window, wrapped now in the second towel, her silhouette framed in pale light. Her eyes met his briefly, unreadable. "You'll come back tonight?" she asked, and though her tone was even, he heard the edge beneath it, the bracing. For disappointment, for rejection. "Yes," he said simply. "I'll come back." Her lips pressed together, and though she didn't smile, some tension eased in her shoulders. That evening, when he returned, the apartment smelled faintly of boiled grain. Orvia sat at the table, hair tied loosely with a strip of torn fabric, wearing one of his old shirts he'd left folded on the chair. It hung loose on her frame, but it was clothing, not rags. She didn't look up when he entered, only continued tearing bread into neat halves, placing one piece in front of his chair. The small gesture unsettled him more than anything. She had woven herself into the space without permission, shaping it as though it had always belonged to two instead of one. He sat, and she looked up finally, her eyes steady. "You said one night," she reminded him. "It's morning again." He opened his mouth, but the answer was already there. He didn't want her gone. Not yet, not tomorrow, maybe not ever. He leaned back, exhaling. Stay another day. We'll decide again after that. Her shoulders loosened, just a fraction. She nodded once. "That's all I ask. One day at a time." And for the first time, Leroy realized that his careful routines, the armor of repetition he had lived behind for years, had been broken beyond repair. And what replaced them was something unpredictable, fragile and alive. The rain had returned by nightfall, a steady tapping against the cracked window panes that bled chill into the flat. Leroy lay on the floor, blanket pulled around his shoulders, staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily. His body knew the discomfort of the boards too well, but tonight it wasn't the ache in his side keeping him awake. It was the sound of her breathing from the cot, slow, uneven, broken at moments, as though she were forcing her body to rest while her mind stayed alert. He thought of her words at the table earlier, one day at a time, and knew she had meant it for her. Every dawn was a gamble, another chance to be cast out again. The floor creaked softly. He turned his head and saw Orvia shift under the thin blanket. The draft from the broken window frame made her shiver. She pulled the fabric tighter, but it wasn't enough. Leroy pushed himself up before he could talk himself out of it, pulling his own blanket free. He crossed the room quietly and draped it over her. Her eyes opened halfway, green hair falling across her face in the dim light. She didn't move, only watched him with tired, alert eyes. "You didn't have to," she whispered. "I know," he said simply. For a moment she searched his face, as though weighing his honesty. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible gesture, she lifted the edge of the blanket. The motion wasn't an invitation to anything beyond warmth, but it carried weight all the same. He hesitated only a breath before sitting on the cot beside her, careful not to press too close. They lay shoulder to shoulder, stiff at first, the silence between them louder than the rain outside. He could feel the warmth radiating from her, the way her breathing steadied when she realized he wasn't moving away. Slowly, her head tilted, resting against him. Damp strands of her hair brushed his cheek. Leroy stared upward, every nerve awake, but beneath the flood of doubts ran a quiet certainty. This closeness wasn't a mistake. Her voice came low, nearly lost under the storm. "You asked me why I didn't run when you caught me. Do you want to know the truth?" He turned his head slightly. "Yes, because running again would mean I was guilty. Because if you were going to throw me out, I wanted you to do it looking at me, not as a shadow, not as a thief as myself. The honesty stripped him raw. He had no words to answer with, so he simply met her gaze. For the first time since she'd entered his home, her lips curved faintly in almost smile. It was small, fragile, but real. She shifted closer, her shoulder pressing against his. Leroy's chest tightened, every instinct telling him to keep still, to avoid breaking whatever fragile line lay between them. But her eyes lingered on his, unflinching, waiting. He lifted a hand slowly, brushing a strand of green hair from her cheek. She didn't flinch. She leaned into the touch. Their lips met softly, tentative at first, a searching brush that deepened when neither pulled away. The kiss was hesitant, but steady, carrying all the weight of what they hadn't said. Her hand curled lightly at the back of his neck. His fingers found her waist. When they parted, both were breathing unevenly. The world narrowed to the closeness of the cot and the storm beyond. "You don't know what this means for me," she whispered. "Then tell me." He murmured, "It means I'm not invisible anymore." Her words cut sharper than any plea could. Leroy kissed her again, slower this time, his hand steady at her back. She let herself rest against him, her guard lowered in a way it hadn't been since the night he first found her in the shower. That night, she didn't retreat to her corner. She stayed beside him until exhaustion pulled her under, her breathing even at last. Leroy remained awake longer, staring into the dim light, knowing with certainty that his life had crossed a line. This was no longer about survival, no longer about pity. It was about trust, about choice. And for the first time in years, he realized he no longer feared the break in his routine. He welcomed it. The days that followed blurred together, not because they were empty, but because they carried a rhythm Leroy had never known before. He woke earlier, listening for the subtle signs of her moving about the flat, the soft scrape of a chair against the floor, the low splash of water in the clumsy sink, the shuffle of her bare feet. Each sound reminded him he was no longer alone. The silence that had once been his constant companion had been replaced by something fragile, yet alive. Orvia changed the shape of the apartment without trying. She swept crumbs from the table after meals, folded the blanket he had used on the floor, even adjusted the old shirt of his she now wore so it fit more securely. The fabric hung loose on her frame, cinched at the waist with a strip torn from her ruined skirt. When she moved, it no longer looked borrowed, but claimed hers now. As much as his, Leroy noticed everything, sometimes too much. When she stretched, her arms at the sink, the collar slipping open to reveal the line of her collarbone, he found his eyes lingering longer than he should. Shame followed quickly, but when he looked away, she never called him out. She continued as if she hadn't noticed, though the faint curve of her lips suggested otherwise. It was on the third day that she spoke what had lingered unasked between them. She stood by the window, green hair damp and falling over her shoulders, the gray light catching faintly against her luminous skin. She didn't notice him watching. At first, her hand pressed lightly against the glass, as if testing the world beyond. When she finally turned, her expression was careful, steady. "No one will come for me," she said. "Not family, not employers, not neighbors. When the contract ended, the quarter guards walked me to the gates and locked them behind me. That was the last time anyone said my name before you did." Her voice didn't waver, but the truth in it hit Leroy harder than any plea could. She wasn't hiding until she was called back. She wasn't waiting for rescue. She had been discarded. Entirely, written out of the world, erased except for the fact of her survival. He poured water into 2 cracked cups, placed one near her hand. His voice came low but certain. "You're not invisible here." Her eyes lifted to his, and for the first time since she had arrived, something shifted in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but the faintest glimmer of relief. She sat opposite him, sipping from the cup in small, measured swallows. For once, she didn't look away quickly when his gaze lingered. Instead, she held it, testing how long he would. That night, she didn't retreat immediately to the cot. She lingered by the table while he worked through his papers, humming softly under her breath. It was faint, almost uncertain, but it filled the air with something his flat had never known before music. When he glanced up, she stopped abruptly, as if caught doing something forbidden. "Don't," he said quietly. "I like it." Her lips pressed together, and though she didn't smile, he saw her shoulders ease. She sat at the cot afterward, hair spilling across her face as she dried it with the towel. Leroy set his pen down and asked the question that had pressed at him since the beginning. "Why did you stay when I caught you? Why not run?" Her hands stilled. She looked at him, tired but defiant. "Because running again would mean I was guilty. And I wasn't. If you were going to throw me out, I wanted you to do it while looking at me. Not as a shadow, as myself." The honesty left him raw. He rose from his chair, walked to where she sat, and for a long moment they only looked at one another. Then slowly he reached out, brushing a strand of green hair from her face. She didn't flinch. She leaned into the touch. The kiss that followed wasn't rushed. It wasn't born of hunger, but of recognition. Two people who had lived too long unseen, finally choosing to see each other. Her lips were warm, trembling faintly, her breath catching against his. His hands found her waist. Hers curled lightly at the back of his neck. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his, her voice quiet but steady. "I used to think touch was only a bargain. Something traded, something taken. But this," she drew in a shaky breath, "this feels different. It feels like choice." "It is," Leroy whispered. "Yours, mine." Her eyes glistened faintly, but she didn't look away. "Then let's choose again." That night, she didn't ask for another towel or pull the blanket tight to separate herself. She shifted against him on the cot, her body warm, her breathing steady, her guard lowered for the first time. And when sleep finally claimed her, her head rested on his chest, not as a guest waiting to be cast out, but as someone who belonged. For Leroy, it was the moment he understood the truth. He no longer wanted his life of silence and repetition. What he wanted was here, in his arms, choosing him as much as he had chosen her. By the end of the week, Leroy's apartment no longer felt like a solitary man's refuge. Small signs of Orvia's presence had taken root in ways that could not be ignored. An extra towel folded neatly beside his own. 2 cups drying by the sink instead of one. His old shirt, once crumpled in the back of a drawer, now shaped by the hard curve of her shoulders and cinched by a makeshift belt. Even the silence between them had changed. It no longer felt like 2 people wary of breaking it, but like a quiet they shared, one layered with unspoken understanding. Leroy noticed how easily he had adapted. When neighbors knocked, his lies came without hesitation. A complaint about the water pressure? He spoke of heater malfunctions. A question about the noise of pipes at night? He shrugged, saying it was nothing new. He had never been a convincing liar before, but now he found the words spilling naturally, almost protectively. It unsettled him, but it also felt necessary. Orvia, for her part, moved through the flat with a careful confidence, as though she was learning the boundaries by testing them slowly. She swept, she cooked what little they had. She folded the blanket he used on the floor. Each gesture carried weight. "I am not a burden. I will not be thrown out." But even as she settled into the rhythm of his space, there remained a watchfulness in her eyes, a constant searching for the moment he might change his mind. It was on a gray morning, when the rain had finally paused, and pale light spilled through the blinds that she asked the question she had been carrying for days. Leroy had just set the kettle to boil when she stepped closer, her hands folded tight around themselves, her shoulders squared as though bracing for rejection. "You said one night, then you said another, and then another." She met his gaze without wavering. "Do you mean it? Or am I just waiting for you to decide I've stayed long enough?" The words hung between them, sharper than any knife. Leroy turned slowly, meeting her eyes. He saw no plea there, no manipulation. Only pride and fear, bound together. "I haven't decided to turn you out," he said carefully. "Not once." Her jaw tightened. "But you could. Tomorrow. Next week." With a single word. That's what I live with every moment. Waiting for the floor to drop beneath me. He set the kettle aside, crossed the room, and stood close enough to see the faint glow in her alien eyes. His voice was steady now, stripped of hesitation. "Then stop waiting. Stay. Not as a guest, not as someone passing through. Stay here. With me." Her lips parted, and for a heartbeat she didn't seem to know how to respond. Her eyes glistened faintly, and she let out a quiet laugh that carried disbelief more than humor. "No one has ever said that to me," she whispered. "Not once. Not even when I had a home before." Leroy reached for her hand, took it firmly, grounding her in the moment. "Then let this be the first. And the last time you ever have to ask." The weight that had bound her seemed to lift all at once. She pressed her forehead to his chest, her voice low but certain. "Then I'm yours, and you're mine." That night, they sat by the window together, the city's neon lights flickering in the puddles below, the hum of distant streets carrying through the glass. Orvia leaned into him, her fingers entwined with his. For the first time, her smile wasn't cautious or fleeting. It was full, unguarded, and real. When they lay together on the cot, she didn't hesitate, didn't brace herself for rejection. She curled against him as if she belonged, and he held her with the quiet certainty of a man who had stopped measuring his life by routine. The walls of the flat, once bare and empty, now held something neither of them had expected: permanence. And as the night deepened, Leroy understood what had shifted. The woman who had snuck into his home begging only for a chance to be clean was no longer a stranger, no longer a burden. She was his choice, and he was hers. Whatever storm might come from outside no longer mattered. Inside these walls they had chosen each other. Several weeks passed before either of them noticed how deeply their lives had changed. The apartment, once a hollow shell of repetition, now bore traces of permanence. Orvia's strip of cloth hung by the wall like it belonged. There, 2 plates always sat drying by the sink. Even the neighbors' curiosity had dulled. Mrs. Dinner still muttered about rattling pipes, but she had stopped peering into Leroy's doorway. Inside, the air was no longer tense with waiting for tomorrow's decision. It was alive with the fragile comfort of shared space. Yet Leroy often caught Orvia at the window late at night, staring at the streets below with her hand pressed to the glass. Her expression was unreadable, as though she was listening for a sound only she could hear. When he asked, she always brushed it aside with a quiet, "Just thinking." But the weight in her eyes told him more. There was something unspoken she carried, something he hadn't earned the right to hear. The truth came one evening when the rain had finally cleared, leaving the city soaked and gleaming. Leroy returned from the registry later than usual, shoulders heavy, but as soon as he opened the door, the weariness fell away. Orvia stood by the stove, her hair brushed smooth, wearing one of his shirts altered with neat stitches at the seams. She turned to him with a smile that lit her face unguarded. "You're late," she said, the same words she had once spoken in jest, but now her voice carried warmth. "Am I forgiven?" he asked. "That depends," she replied, stepping closer, her eyes bright. "What did you bring me?" He set a small bundle on the table. Fruit rarer than their usual rations, a small luxury scraped from a week's worth of saving. She unwrapped it carefully, touched the skin with reverence, then looked back at him with a teasing smirk. "You think this will earn forgiveness?" "It's a start," he said, but his chest eased at the sound of her laugh. They ate together, side by side, and afterwards sat by the window, watching the glow of neon ripple across the puddles. She leaned into him, her fingers entwined with his, her head resting against his shoulder. For the first time, she seemed utterly at peace, but when she spoke next, her voice was low, careful. "Leroy, there's something you need to know." The words turned the air heavy. He shifted slightly, but didn't let go of her hand. "Tell me." She hesitated, then drew in a slow breath. "I wasn't just another worker they cast out. Not like thee. Men they kept, not like the women who were turned away. I was part of something else, a program." Her voice caught, and she forced it steady. "They called us durables, modified for endurance, for obedience, not citizens, not people, contracts without rights. When they were done with us, we weren't released. We were erased." Leroy's chest tightened. He had suspected pieces her luminous eyes, the way her body seemed too resilient, despite years of hardship. But hearing it spoken aloud was different. She continued, eyes fixed on the city below. "I escaped when they downsized, slipped out through the gates when they thought no one was watching. I've been running ever since. That's why I hide in shadows. That's why I measure every word. Because if they find me—" She broke off, her jaw tightening. "I am property to them, not a person." Leroy turned fully, gripping her hands. "You're not property. Not here, not ever." Her gaze lifted to his, and in her glowing eyes was a mixture of defiance and fear. "You don't understand. If they discover me here, they won't just drag me back. They'll come for you too. No one is allowed to shelter what they've thrown away. It's a crime, Leroy." The weight of it pressed into him, but instead of fear, he felt clarity settle in his chest. He cupped her face in his hands, steadying her. "Let them come. If they want you, they'll have to go through me." For the first time, her composure broke. Her breath shuddered, her lips trembling as if the idea of being defended, truly defended, was something she had never dared imagine. She leaned into him, and when she whispered, her voice was raw. "No one has ever said that for me." He kissed her forehead gently. "Then remember it, because I mean every word." Outside, the city thrummed, indifferent as ever. But inside that narrow flat, a line had been drawn. What had begun as a broken routine, a simple kindness to a stranger, had become something dangerous, something irreversible. Orvia was no longer invisible, no longer alone. And Leroy Vosk, clerk of the registry towers, had become more than a quiet man with a routine. He was her shield, her choice, her partner in defiance. For the first time, both of them knew the truth. Survival was no longer enough. What they had was worth the risk of everything.